At the end of the book of Genesis, we find Joseph's brothers selling their brother into slavery. That's the beginning of a journey that leads us to the Exodus. So the Joseph saga is a lens through which we can view the Exodus and understand what God is doing at the Passover. The story, of course, takes an unexpected turn once Joseph arrives in Egypt. He ends up as Secretary of Agriculture to the Pharaoh of Egypt, saving the Egyptians from a deadly drought. The last scene in Genesis is of Joseph's brothers traveling to Egypt in order that they too might be saved from the drought, only to find their long-lost brother in charge. They rightly fear Joseph's revenge, but instead, here's what we read. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing today." Even though human beings intended harm, God transforms our evil into good. God took the occasion of God's people in slavery in Egypt, combined with natural disasters, and intended it for something good, the liberation of God's people from slavery. This gives us a lens to understand the cross as well. Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem gives us another glimpse of what God is doing before the Passion begins. Usually a conquering warrior, after defeating the enemy, rides a white stallion into the conquered city. But Jesus was not coming to start a war or to overthrow the Romans. The victory had already been won. Jesus' entry into the city is a prophetic announcement that the kingdom of God has come. Leadership in the kingdom of God looks much different from leadership in the kingdoms of this world. Jesus said to his disciples, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them. But it is not so with you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." In John's Gospel that we read this evening, we see the human face of God in Jesus. Jesus rose from the table and took off his outer robe. Now we have a lens to see through and see what God is doing. The Greek used for Jesus laying aside his outer robe is the same used when Jesus spoke earlier in John's Gospel of himself as the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for his flock. Jesus lays everything down for others in service to God. His outer garment, and then his inner garment, his body. Of course, you don't need to know any Greek to anticipate the disciples' shock. Their master is acting like a servant, a slave. There's a magnificent rendition of this precise moment by the artist Ford Madox Brown, who painted Jesus washing Peter's feet. An earlier version of the painting depicts Jesus only partially clad, with a bare torso, a loincloth and a towel tied around his waist. Well, this display of the painting caused quite an outcry in 19th century society, and so Brown later clothed his Jesus. But notice Jesus firmly grasped the right foot of Peter, who is seated higher than Jesus, his head sunk into his chin, looking intently at his master. Peter's left foot dangles in a basin of water. The look on Peter's face perfectly illustrates the gospel. At once embarrassed, downcast, and above all, uncomfortable. Behind them at the table sit the disciples. One loosens the thongs of his sandals, readying for his washing. Another peers over Peter to see what's going on. Another holds his anguished face in his hands. Some disciples are easily seen, others recede in the gloom of that space. This is not a merely symbolic washing. Peter is clearly appalled by what Jesus is doing. The IHM religious sister Sandra Schneider, is a New Testament scholar, believes that in John's Gospel, the foot washing is more about the mutual service of friendship, a mutual sharing of gifts that in no way implies any sort of domination. The message is not so much that the master has become the slave, but that all are on the same level. In the foot washing, Jesus challenges his disciples to do the same for each other and to see that all are equal friends in the kingdom. Nobody is above or below in any way. Even an emphasis on humble service can be a power dynamic. There is no domination by anyone, but rather an invitation to equality. This may actually help explain Peter's strong reaction. He sees that this requires a radical reinterpretation of his own life world, a genuine conversion of some kind which he was not prepared to undergo. Very truly, Jesus said, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, Jesus said, you are blessed if you do them. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus commands us, do this in memory of me. But here, in John's Gospel, where John doesn't tell us about the breaking of the bread or the sharing of the cup, John tells us only, if you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. The washing of the feet is all that John tells us about that meal. St. Ignatius of Loyola wrote, love shows itself more in actions than in words. Imagine what kind of church we might be if we began every Sunday Mass with the pastor washing the feet of some parishioners. Perhaps those who are going to go out for an outreach ministry, or those who have just returned from some ministry of service. Perhaps we would wash the feet of the Eucharistic ministers as they take communion to the homebound. Maybe we could wash the feet of the newly married or people who were recently divorced. We could wash the feet of victims of discrimination or of sexual abuse, refugees, immigrants, or as Pope Francis did today, prisoners. Let's imagine all those feet and all those people, for we do this in memory of Jesus.